Is it lovely?
Okay, sorry about that. Hello, everybody. Thank you. I'm really happy to have discovered this space of research, which I actually think I appreciate this because it's so important to have these kinds of debates. So thank you, Mary Claire. And I think the stakes of SRHR violations sometimes seem so high, or actually, I suppose all human rights violations, that sometimes we don't take the time or feel really comfortable making critiques. And I will just be critiquing. I am an academic, and this is why I'm saying that perhaps. But it's really important to step back from firefighting mode and think about what it is that we're doing wrong, as well as what it is we've done right. And carceral logic is something that many of us have inherited from our, from being particularly in post-colonial states where, independence really meant that you went from being a subject to a citizen, and being a citizen meant having rights, and having rights meant having laws. So I can see how feminist movements in places in South Asia and the MENA region and elsewhere would be so invested in turning to the state for any kind of redress. I think there's a real historical legacy there that we need to take into consideration. That having been said, the reason we are talking about it, I think the carceral state, as everywhere in the US where I'm sitting right now, and everywhere has deeply, deeply problematic implications, especially for the most marginalized populations. And I think sometimes it's very hard for feminists, as well as others involved development institutions, to really hear that meaningfully. So I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about what I see happening in Bangladesh in the discourse around child marriage today, where I see a real disjunction between the discourse of sexual and bodily autonomy of adolescents, which is what we hear about, at the UN and places like CSVR and, in mainstream fora, between that and the kind of punitive child marriage laws that we have. They just grate against each other. And this has become even more of an issue since 2017, when the Bangladesh government amended the 1929, we had a colonial law from 1929 called the Child Marriage Restraint Act, which had its own very different connotations, amended it so that our version until 2017 was that girls could not get married under the age of 18. But under this 2017 amendment, girls between 16 and 18 could get married if they had parental permission or permission from the courts. Now, of course, this produced, rightly, a lot of outrage from feminists, from other, just generally from people actually globally, as well as, inside Bangladesh. It seems to me that the state doing this actually opened up a space to talk about what was wrong with the child marriage law itself. Now, first I'll give you the state's logic of doing this, of lowering the age, which was, and it wasn't necessarily pandering to the right, the religious right, which happily took this on board actually, which was interesting. But the state had this is a developmental state with a very particular kind of protectionist and paternalist logic. So the state minister for women's affairs actually went in, or, her deputy stood up in parliament and said, well, we're a very successful state as far as development indicators are concerned. We have gender parity in not just primary schools, but at the primary level, but at the secondary level. So, you know, our girls are mixing with boys in school. We have women, we have the second, you know, we have a booming garment industry. You know, our women are great symbols of empowerment, but these are girls going into factories and working with men. We know what happens when you have this kind of mixing. Girls will be seduced by these men and they will get pregnant. And we have introduced this provision so that parents can protect their pregnant daughters and marry them to the people that they've been in sexual relationships with. Now, this is obviously the kind of logic that we really need to push back against. It's a kind of logic in which the girl, the, you know, 16, 17-year-old girl or all people, you know, who fall under this law are constructed as children who are, you know, people with no sexual agency, no ability to have any, you know, who have no rights over their own body. It's the parents or the state who have rights. So it's reinforcing the rights of the patriarchal state or the patriarchal family over the child, right? So of course you have to be against that. But what is happening at the same time is that thinking feminists have been, the feminist double bind, as I say, was really pushed to the surface. This 16 to 17-year-old category, really, that the state is concerned about, is very different from the idea of the child in child marriage. And child marriage discourses come from older colonial discourses of, you know, they invoke images of 8 and 9-year-olds, you know, being forced into marriage with these older men and then dying on their deathbeds. That's how the 1929 law, you know, came in. There's a longer history to that. But when we are talking about marriage laws now, we're not just talking about 12-year-olds or 13-year-olds, we're also talking about 16 and 17-year-olds. And what's happening with a law that's called child marriage, it's collapsing all of these people. So it's taking away a certain kind of sexual agency, but it's also taking away from conversations that can be had, because feminists can't say, well, we have to treat the 16 and, you know, feminists can't be for a law that allows child marriage, because frankly, who could be for child marriage? Nobody is for that, right? But there's a very interesting shift in language that I've seen from 2008, say, to 2018. So in 2008, the World Bank brought out a report called Whispers to Voices. And in that report, they said, they used the term early marriage. And they said early marriage happens despite, you know, there are these incredible leaps in education, lowered fertility, we don't know why, but it wasn't the problem. Clearly, in that report, there was a sense that other structural issues needed to be looked at. Oh, not that the World Bank report did that, but one could read into that there was something wrong with the larger narrative. You needed to look at why early marriage, which was around 16 in that report, wasn't talked about. 10 years later, everything on Bangladesh is about how Bangladesh has the second or third highest rate of child marriage. That language of early marriage is gone. The World Bank, the Nike Foundation, anybody, Plan International, Bangladeshi NGOs, everybody's using the term child marriage. And that's the context in which this Child Marriage Amendment Act comes. I think we need to, and I've actually done a lot of research on how this shift happens. And as far as I can tell, this shift happens partly because corporations become invested in young women's raced and classed bodies. And they don't want to talk about, you know, and they draw on something the World Bank has on, you know, called smart economics, which means educating girls. And the idea is if you educate girls, they won't fall into these cultural bad practices like marriage, child marriage, and then they would go on and save themselves and save the world. It's very interesting that Nike, the Nike Foundation, and other people begin to promote both the empowerment of girls and child marriage as a problem that needs to be struggled against at the same time. And so what happens is a muddling of very different sets of problems. And in fact, according to Plan International, in 2011, 2% of girls in Bangladesh got married under the age of 11. And there's statistics going around in Bangladesh, around Bangladesh, that 59% of girls are married, child marriage rates are 59%. If you look at it, the bulk of it is women between 16 and 18. And that's where the problem of sexual and reproductive autonomy, bodily autonomy comes in. But I think the language itself is beginning to stop us from thinking about why parents want their children to get married early, but why girls, especially, but also boys, are not able to exercise a certain kind of autonomy. And I think decriminalizing this, not allowing parents more power, decriminalizing child marriage, not just insisting on even higher increases, which is what some feminists have said, in the child marriage rate in response to the amendment, but having conversations around what exactly is going on is something that we really need to begin to think about. And that involves donors, that involves international NGOs and the feminist movement, and of course, corporations. Thanks. I leave it there.